April 28, 1945, 0347 hours, Central Berlin, Germany. The explosion shook the ground above like thunder from below. Oberkofreider Klaus Weber pressed his face against the concrete bunker wall, feeling the vibrations travel through his bones. But this wasn't artillery. This wasn't bombing. This was something else entirely, something that would swallow 200 German soldiers whole and leave behind only questions that wouldn't be answered for decades. What happened in those tunnels beneath Berlin that night would become one of World War II's most disturbing mysteries, a story the Allies buried, a tragedy the Wehrmacht never recorded, and a secret that would haunt the few survivors for the rest of their lives. But first, you need to understand what drove desperate men underground as their world collapsed above them. By late April 1945, Berlin had transformed into something from Dante's imagination. Soviet artillery thundered constantly, turning entire city blocks into smoking rubble. The air reeked of cordite, burning flesh, and something worse, the smell of a civilization dying. Klaus Weber, 19 years old, and already a veteran of 3 brutal years on the Eastern Front, crouched in a bunker that had once been a subway station. Around him, the remnants of the 9th Parachute Division, boys mostly, some as young as 14, clutched weapons they barely knew how to use. Their orders were simple: defend Berlin to the last man. But Klaus had heard whispers about another option, something the officers were discussing in hushed tones when they thought the enlisted men weren't listening. The tunnels. Berlin's underground was a labyrinth that few fully understood. The city sat atop layers of history, medieval cellars, 19th century sewer systems, U-Bahn tunnels, and newer constructions built during the war years. But there was more. Military engineers had been secretly connecting these systems since 1943, creating escape routes for high-ranking officials should the city fall. These tunnels were supposed to be salvation. Instead, they became something far more sinister. April 28, 1945, 2100 hours. Hauptmann Friedrich Müller gathered his surviving officers in what remained of the Chancellery's lower levels. The man looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 days. Hollowed cheeks, bloodshot eyes, hands that trembled when he thought no one was watching. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice barely audible over the Soviet shells falling above them, "we have received unofficial authorization for Operation Erdschland, Operation Earth Swallow." The plan was desperate beyond measure. With Soviet forces closing the noose around the city center, small groups of German soldiers would evacuate through the tunnel network to predetermined rally points outside Berlin. From there they would regroup and continue resistance from the forests and mountains of southern Germany. It was fantasy disguised as strategy. But for men facing certain death or capture, fantasy seemed preferable to reality. Klaus received his orders at 0200 hours on April 29th. He would lead a section of 23 men through a specific route down through the U-Bahn system, following painted arrows that would guide them through connected passages, emerging near Wannsee where they would link up with other surviving units. The painted arrows had been placed by advance teams weeks earlier, fresh white paint on dark stone, pointing the way to safety, or so they believed. April 29th, 1945, 315 hours. Friedrichstrasse, U-Bahn station. Klaus led his men down the station steps, their boots echoing in the abandoned tunnel. The platform stretched ahead of them, in darkness, broken only by their flickering torches. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear water dripping, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that seemed to count down their remaining time above ground. "Stay close," Klaus whispered to his section. "Watch for the arrows. Don't lose sight of the man in front of you." They weren't the only group using the tunnels that night. Intelligence suggested that over 200 soldiers were being evacuated through various routes, all converging toward the same general area west of the city. It was supposed to be coordinated, organized, military precision, applied to desperation. Behind them, Berlin burned. Ahead of them, the tunnels beckoned with promises of escape that would prove to be lies. The first sign something was wrong came when they reached a junction where 3 tunnels met. According to their maps, there should have been arrows pointing left toward the Wannsee route. Instead, they found arrows pointing in all three directions. Fresh white paint, identical to what they'd been following. "Which way?" asked Gefreiter Hans Richter, barely 16, and terrified despite his attempts to appear brave. Klaus studied the arrows, unease growing in his stomach. The map showed only one route through this section. But someone, or something, had painted arrows in multiple directions. "We follow the original route," he decided. "Left tunnel." If he had chosen differently, Klaus Weber might not have been the only man to walk out of the Berlin tunnels alive that night. The left tunnel sloped steadily downward, taking them deeper underground than their maps indicated was possible. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. Their torches seemed to burn dimmer, as if the darkness was actively fighting against the light. After another hour of walking, they reached what appeared to be a natural cavern, a vast underground space that their torches couldn't fully illuminate. The ceiling disappeared into blackness above them. The walls curved away beyond their vision. This wasn't on any map they'd seen. "Mein Gott," whispered someone behind Klaus. "How far down are we?" The painted arrows continued across the cavern floor, leading toward what appeared to be another tunnel entrance on the far side. But now they could see something else that made Klaus's blood freeze. Other arrows, dozens of them, different colors, different ages of paint, some recent, some that looked weeks or even months old, all pointing in different directions across the cavern floor, as if many groups had passed through this place, marking routes that led where. They weren't alone in the cavern. As they crossed the open space, their torchlight revealed other groups of German soldiers, small clusters of men who moved like ghosts between the stone formations. Some acknowledged them with silent nods. Others seemed not to see them at all, focused entirely on following their own painted trails deeper into the earth. Klaus counted at least 60 men in various groups crossing the cavern, all following different arrow trails, all heading toward different tunnel mouths that yawned like hungry mouths around the cavern's perimeter. None of them would be seen again. In the center of the cavern, Klaus made a decision that would save his life and haunt his dreams forever. While his men rested and shared their dwindling water rations, he climbed a pile of broken stone to get a better view of the cavern and plan their next move. From his elevated position, he could see something that chilled him more than the underground cold. The painted arrows weren't random, they formed a pattern, guiding groups in a slow spiral toward the center of the cavern, then outward again toward tunnel mouths that were wrong somehow. The tunnels were too regular, too perfectly shaped. These weren't natural formations or hastily dug wartime constructions. They showed evidence of careful engineering, purposeful design, and they were old, far older than the current war. Movement in one of the tunnels caught his attention. A figure emerged, tall, wearing what appeared to be a German uniform, but something was wrong with its movements. It walked too stiffly, too mechanically, and when it turned toward the cavern, Klaus caught a glimpse of its face in the torchlight. Or rather, what should have been its face. Klaus scrambled down from his vantage point, his heart hammering. "We're leaving," he told his men. "Now." "But the mission," Richter began. "The mission is compromised. We go back. We take our chances with the Russians." As Klaus led his section back toward the tunnel they'd entered through, he could hear other groups still moving deeper into the cavern system, following their painted arrows toward destinations they would never reach. The sound of their boots on stone grew fainter and fainter until it was swallowed entirely by the oppressive silence of the deep earth. Behind them, something that might once have been human watched from the tunnel mouths and waited patiently for the next group of desperate soldiers to follow the helpful arrows painted on ancient stone. April 29th, 1905 und 40. 800 hours. Friedrichstrasse U-Bahn station. Klaus and his men emerged into a Berlin that was still dying, but at least it was dying under open sky. Soviet artillery continued its methodical destruction of the city, but to Klaus, even the sound of shells falling seemed preferable to the absolute silence they'd left behind in the deep tunnels. They surrendered to the first Soviet patrol they encountered. Prison camp seemed infinitely safer than whatever waited in the depths beneath Berlin. Klaus never spoke officially about what he'd seen in the cavern. His after-action report, filed during his initial interrogation by Soviet intelligence, mentioned only that his group had become lost in the tunnel system and returned to the surface. No mention of the cavern, the multiple arrow systems, or the figure with no face. But he did speak privately, years later, to a British historian researching unexplained disappearances during the fall of Berlin. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, Cambridge University specialist in wartime missing persons cases, first encountered Klaus Weber's name in 1963 while researching German military records for her book about the final days of the Third Reich. His case was unusual. A soldier who had surrendered voluntarily when escape routes were still available, claiming his unit had gotten lost in tunnels that, according to official maps, didn't exist. Intrigued, she tracked Klaus to a small town in Bavaria, where he worked as a postal clerk and tried to forget the war. It took 3 visits before he agreed to speak with her, and only then because she mentioned that other veterans had reported similar experiences. "You know about the others?" Klaus asked, his hands shaking as he lit his 4th cigarette of their conversation. "Some. Not many. Most refused to talk." Klaus nodded slowly. "They are wise to stay silent. But I am old now. And the dreams have never stopped." Over the course of several interviews, Klaus provided Dr. Thornfield with details that no official record contained: the depth of the tunnel system, the age of some of the construction, the systematic way the painted arrows had been arranged to guide groups deeper underground. Most disturbing were his descriptions of what he'd glimpsed in the tunnel mouths around the cavern's perimeter. Armed with Klaus's testimony, Dr. Thornfield began examining missing person reports from the final weeks of the war in Berlin. The numbers were staggering and suspicious. Over 800 German soldiers had been reported as presumed killed in action during the last week of April 1945, but their bodies were never recovered. No witnesses to their deaths, no evidence of the engagements that supposedly claimed their lives. More troubling were the similarities in their final orders. Nearly all had been assigned to special evacuation missions through underground routes. All had been given maps showing tunnel systems that, according to city engineers, didn't match Berlin's actual underground infrastructure. Dr. Thornfield's research led her to archives in Prague, where she discovered Waffen-SS documents referring to something called Aktion Erdgeist, Operation Earth Spirit. The files were heavily redacted, but what remained suggested a program to utilize existing archaeological resources for strategic defensive purposes. Archaeological resources, as if the tunnels weren't military constructions, but something much older that had been discovered and repurposed. In 1969, Dr. Thornfield's research was classified under the Official Secrets Act. Her book was never published. Her files were seized by government agents who explained that certain wartime discoveries remained sensitive to national security interests. But by then, she had already shared her preliminary findings with Klaus Weber during their final interview. What she told him confirmed his worst suspicions about what had been waiting in those deep tunnels. The German High Command hadn't discovered the tunnel system beneath Berlin. They had been led to it, guided by archaeological advisors who had joined the Nazi Party early in its rise to power, men who claimed expertise in ancient Germanic history, but whose real knowledge ran much deeper and darker. These advisors had identified similar tunnel complexes beneath several German cities, all showing evidence of construction techniques that weren't quite human, all containing carved symbols and architectural features that suggested builders who understood things about the relationship between darkness and hunger that modern minds preferred to ignore. Operation Earth Swallow hadn't been a desperate escape plan. It had been a feeding operation. Klaus Weber died in 1973, taking his full story to the grave. Dr. Thornfield lived until 1991, but never again researched unexplained disappearances. The British government's file on their investigation remains classified, but Klaus did leave one final testimony, recorded secretly and hidden in his house, for his grandson to find decades later. In it he described the dreams that had haunted him for nearly 30 years. Dreams of his fellow soldiers following painted arrows deeper and deeper underground, their voices gradually changing from human speech to something else entirely, as the tunnels transformed them into something that could survive in absolute darkness. Dreams of vast underground spaces filled with the sounds of feeding. Dreams of painted arrows that glowed with their own light, leading an endless procession of desperate men toward destinations where hunger waited with infinite patience. Today, Berlin's underground is a carefully mapped and monitored system. The U-Bahn operates on schedules maintained with German precision. City engineers know every tunnel, every junction, every maintenance access point, or so they claim. Construction workers occasionally report finding blocked tunnels that don't appear on any blueprint, passages that slope downward at impossible angles, walls marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. These discoveries are quickly sealed with concrete and forgotten. The workers are transferred to other projects. The reports disappear into municipal archives, where they join hundreds of similar documents dating back to the city's reconstruction. But sometimes, late at night, subway workers report hearing sounds from behind those concrete seals, rhythmic scratching, like fingernails on stone. Voices calling in languages that aren't quite German, aren't quite human. And sometimes, when the trains aren't running and the tunnels are empty, maintenance crews find fresh paint on old walls, white arrows pointing toward sealed passages, as if something is still trying to guide lost souls deeper into the earth. The arrows are always painted over immediately. The reports are always classified. Because some hungers are older than war, older than nations, older than the civilizations that build cities above their feeding grounds. And some of those hungers are still waiting. The 200 soldiers who vanished beneath Berlin on the night of April 29, 1945, were never officially declared dead. Their names appear on no monument. Their families received no closure. They simply walked into the darkness and became part of something that should not be named. But their voices, according to those who claim to have heard them, still echo in the deep places beneath Berlin, calling for others to follow the painted arrows home.